We're now going to move on to the second panel, and I'm happy to introduce Jessica Brown, who is the moderator, who, among many other jobs, chairs IUCN's Protected Landscape Specialist Group.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Archer, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this wonderful conference. Throughout the day, we have been speaking about the connections between people and nature. We all know that cultural landscapes are the result of people. These are places shaped by the interrelationship between humans and nature over time. We shape the landscape, and in turn, we are shaped by it. As Monica eloquently reminded us this morning, we are the landscape. We are in relation to and not apart from the landscape. And so as we consider the cultural landscapes that we've been talking about today and that we'll talk about in the next few days, we need to honor and recognize that long and complex relationship, but also to recognize that these landscapes are here not just because of that relationship, but because of stewardship, because of the care provided by the communities who live in and near these places. And stewardship, which is the theme of this panel, is simply about responsibility. It's people taking care of places. In most living cultural landscapes that we're considering here, these are typically indigenous, traditional, and other local communities. These communities bring a wealth of knowledge, traditional management systems, innovation, and love of place to managing these special landscapes. So one imperative that we face in the 21st century is how to sustain that relationship and foster stewardship. In this panel, but I think also throughout the course of the conference, we're going to be hearing about examples of stewardship by communities, by indigenous, local, traditional communities. Today, in this section, we have 4 panelists who will be presenting experience from diverse regions of the world. Following the presentation, I hope we'll have time for a dialogue, and that will include some participatory elements, so be ready. And some of the questions I hope that we can explore in the course of the panel, but also in the course of our dialogue, are these. What are the social structures and traditional knowledge and practice that are most vital in shaping and sustaining the landscape? What are the livelihoods of people in the community, and how are they linked to the landscape? What kinds of governance regimes are involved in the management of the landscape? And by governance, what I'm talking about here is not just governance by government entities, but also by private entities in collaborative management relationships and by communities. So there's sort of a broad spectrum of governance that we want to think about as we hear these examples of community stewardship. What are the intangible values of the landscape? Does the sacred play a role in conservation? And what kinds of partnerships exist between the community leadership and external actors, among local institutions, between communities, and between regions? It's a lot, but I hope that some of the presentations will touch on that, and we'll have a chance to touch on that in our discussion. Our first speaker will be Theresa Pasqual, and my pleasure to invite her to come up. Theresa currently serves as the director for the Pueblo of Acama's Historic Preservation Office and as historic site director for Acama's Sky City, which has been recognized by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. In her capacity as director, she's charged with protecting the cultural and archaeological and historical resources of the Pueblo, and she serves as a liaison between agencies and also with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Acama leadership, and the greater Acama community. She's been active in advocating for the protection of all cultural resources, including languages of the Pueblo people of the Southwest, and, for example, has been working on a very interesting language retention program in her own Pueblo. So my pleasure to welcome you up, Theresa.
Kwatsi haupa kaitau haupa traya shapka wato shinde shiach erse yak guchinish hanu kuhaya washti hanushta aku mersta. Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to see all of you. I'm glad to have a chance to be with you today. And thank you to Thank you to Jessica for that introduction. Before we get into the dialogue here and before we get into my presentation, it is customary amongst my people, the Pueblo of Acoma people, to give a formal introduction of who we are and where we come from. That is our tradition, that is our custom. It conveys a sense of respect to one another. And so I bring greetings to you from my Pueblo people. Acoma Pueblo is situated about an hour west of Albuquerque in the state of New Mexico. And as the picture that you see before you, the mesa top houses the Pueblo village, which currently still has no running water or no electricity. But in order to understand this conversation that we're having about landscapes and also protection of those landscapes and this concept of stewardship, we really have to go to the beginning. For my people, for the Acoma people and the Pueblo people in the state of New Mexico, it comes from a time long before, at a time of emergence. Before there was a sun, before there was a moon, before the people ever emerged onto this earth. So as you can imagine, when the people emerged onto this earth from a place to the north, from a place that we call Ship-Up, they were given all of the things that we now consider resources. They were given their relationship to the sun and to the moon. They were given their relationship to the land and to the earth. They were given their seasons. They were also given this sense of a ceremonial world in which would guide them to the beginning. But they were also given these other more tangible resources, the plant life, the animals, the birds, the snow, the air, the water, the things that we need that are vital to our existence as human beings. But they were also given in the early beginnings of emergence, the rules for which they were going to live on this land. Uwash Diyume is the word that we have in Keres. Uwash Diyume means to care for something, to protect something. It is the word that we use that is probably the most equivalent in the English language for stewardship. Out of that emergence came our core values which govern us and help guide us through our life. They are cyclical in nature, and they are guided by the seasons that we encounter. Every ceremony that we have throughout the year is constantly changing based on those seasons. We have values that are respect and love, as well as stewardship. But since the beginning of time and the emergence of our people onto this earth, we also realize that there have been changes to this world that we live in, made with contact with indigenous peoples here on the land. If you look back in history, you begin to see that there are other values that were introduced that indigenous peoples needed to contend with and to react to. They were ideas and laws that were in conflict with what indigenous peoples were living at the time. Concepts of ownership, land ownership, the right to title. As we move forward through time, we can look at the different types of laws and acts that were created here in the United States, laws that continue to challenge our concept of stewardship as Pueblo and indigenous people. They continue right up into the mid-1900s. As Pueblo people have continued to react to these laws, the different changes to land ownership that has happened around us, it has moved us further and further away from our core values. In the eras throughout history, we can look at the different movements that were happening, the forced removal of indigenous people off the landscape, assimilation into Western culture, relocation of our people, and the loss of language and tradition. So we ask ourselves, have we accepted ownership values over stewardship? And how do we change this tide? Why stewardship is important? Stewardship is important for many reasons, many of which you all have started to have that conversation here today. Part of this conversation that we're having is actually one that interests me because it's a conversation that we're having back in Pueblo communities right now. I belong to an organization called the Strategic Leadership Institute. It's the leadership institute that is housed at the Santa Fe Indian School there in Santa Fe for our young people. But we're having this conversation amongst our own people to put forth those questions. And some of those questions are simple as, why is stewardship important? Well, stewardship of these resources is important. One, because of the obvious. One, it protects our land and the resources that we need as people to survive on this earth. But it's also vital to maintaining our language and our tradition. Pueblo people in the Southwest, as well as many indigenous communities, rely on their connection to the land to maintain their language, to maintain their spirituality, to maintain the resources that are needed for medicinal uses, for building their homes, for drinking water, such as the Pueblo that I'm from. We rely on the annual snowfall that comes off Mount Taylor for our drinking water. But we also have to look in this modern day and age as to how we translate our core values into policies that impact us. We cannot go back to the way things were 100 or 1,000 years ago. We live in the here and now. And so we have to work together to make sure that policymakers understand what our core values are, and so that those core values can be translated into policies that then have an impact on us, also help us to manage those resources. We also have to realize as indigenous communities, pueblos and tribes, that we are stronger when we work together and not as an individual. We are stronger when we work as a collective to create change at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level, and even at the international level. We must continuously be cognizant of all the decisions that we make to ask ourselves, are we participating in policies or practices that undermine our core values? And it's critical that that becomes at the forefront of what we do every day. But also in what I do as Historic Preservation Officer, we have to ask ourselves, how are those core values being reflected in our planning? We are, of course, as a TIPO office, as a result of Section 106 under NHPA, we review many of these project proposals that go forward. So in order not to just simply function as part of the process, we have to engage in active dialogue and conversation with all stakeholders so that they understand what are the resources that are at stake. What are the resources that we need to protect, and how can we have development coexist with the protection of these resources? In addition, it's critical that many of our Pueblo people, our tribal people, that we also get them into these key positions so that they can be a part of the change. That they work in fields such as archaeologists or anthropologists, as planners, as engineers, to help manage these resources effectively, and to also help carry our voice and those core values into areas that are critical for tribes. On a human rights perspective, stewardship of these resources is critical. One, because everyone has a right to ensure the protection of these resources. It's not just a tribal right, it's not just a Pueblo right. Everyone has a right to enjoy these resources well into the future. No one person, no one entity, no one industry has the right to take that away from another. But we also put forth finding solutions. Finding solutions comes from, as I noted earlier, not just reacting as part of the process. Here in the United States, tribal historic preservation offices get inundated with requests to review proposals. Oftentimes, these offices are underfunded. They rely on a small amount of money, and in many cases, like my own, they're understaffed. I am an office of one, and I cover a region that is in Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico. So if you call my office and wonder why you can't reach me by phone, it's probably because I'm on the road a lot. We also have a tendency as tribes to make a move towards reacquiring land. Land that was entrusted to us from the point of time onto the emergence into this world. We look at acquiring tracts of land, but unfortunately what we have here now with tribes is tribes are making a move to reacquire tracts of land without putting forth a development plan. Oftentimes we have younger generations of people who come in, tribal members who come in with ideas of putting hotels or casinos, putting in resorts and RV parks, and oftentimes those are not the best uses of those lands. So internally, we also have to have conversations within our own Pueblo communities, tribal communities, about what is the best way to acquire those lands and put a plan back into use for them. One of the critical areas that I'm working on is this shift in relationship. Pueblo and tribal communities here in the United States, by virtue of history, enjoy a relationship called government to government. For those people, for those of you who work here in the United States, you will remember that term because it comes from a historical context of that the United States government has a trust responsibility to ensure that certain things are protected for Native communities. But in this day and age, as we look towards stewardship, we have to go beyond that government to government relationship. It is no longer, you will do this for me or you owe me this. We have to look at stewardship of these resources as being partners in all of this. Maybe perhaps redefining our relationship as co-managers or co-partners in the management and protection of resources. Perhaps in doing these small things and making small steps, we are making a large stride. We are no longer confining ourselves into a small reservation world, which we now operate off of, to thinking ourselves bound by man-made boundaries, but perhaps a much larger world view, which is illustrated on the slide to the right. Small steps can help make big change. When we talk about turning the tide, there have been points in the Pueblo history in which we have made changes, most notably with the return of Taos Blue Lake to the Pueblo of Taos, as well as the protection of Zuni Salt Lake, the home of Zuni Salt women, which is important to Pueblo people, and the place that is near and dear to my heart. Barbara is smiling over there, which is the protection of Mount Taylor, the designation of Mount Taylor as a New Mexico state cultural property, which I was involved in. There are some common understandings for what we do, and I've highlighted 3 here, and of course we will be talking about those at length throughout our conversation. But one of the things that I would like to highlight in this is that number 1 is that it is our collective responsibility. No one person can do this job by themselves. And it is our collective responsibility, whether we are here in the United States or we live halfway across the world, that we work together to find solutions to protecting these resources. But as the photo highlights in this slide, it's not for us. I know as a mother and as a grandmother that what I do now is not for me. It's for my grandchildren. They will be the ones to bear the decisions that we make as adults. And that the decisions that we make and the policies and the laws that we enact, the way that we vote, the way that we interact with each other as stewards of these resources is not for us. It's going to have an effect on our grandchildren and the generations to come. Thank you very much for allowing me to present to you this afternoon. I know it's a small bit of what we do there at the Pueblo of Acoma, and there's more opportunity for dialogue about the much more large projects that we handle. But I would encourage you all in your respective positions in what you do in the countries that you come from to continue forward on your role as stewards of these resources. Tawa.
Thank you so much, Theresa, and thank you for reminding us also of the element of rights and of the rights of future generations.